Hello, this is Shauna Miller, and welcome to the Who For podcast Anthology Volume 1, titled Foundations of Power. The anthology is an argument. It's an argument about the assumptions that we operate on a daily basis. So for humanity, for society to work, these are the understandings or assumptions that all of us acknowledge are true in order to live peacefully, work peacefully, survive. For example, capitalism. We operate on the assumption that capitalism is not only the right answer, but it's the best thing that's ever happened, and it's extremely logical. I agree, it is extremely logical when you start from certain assumptions. Now, do those assumptions exist? Are those assumptions correct? That's what this anthology is about. People can only use the information that they have, their experiences, the data that they've collected. This is what they use to create, their conception of what is real and what reality is and what the world is like. People call this wisdom. The longer that you've lived, the more data you've collected, the more perspective that you have, the more understanding you have, the less you're surprised because your understanding of the world is more complete. However, if you're limited to information that exists to reinforce a system, then your perspective only contains inputs that lead rationally to certain incomes that support that system. So let me say it again. Systems reinforce themselves. That's the whole point of a system. It's to keep itself going. And if the only information that people have access to, or the only information that they are taught, is to keep that system going, then you've potentially missed out on other information or other possible outcomes that, had you had other data or more knowledge, then you might have arrived at different conclusions. Let me give you an example. What if a teacher gave you the wrong equation on purpose? You wrote it down, you performed all the operations required, and you came to the wrong answer. Why did you come to the wrong answer? Well, you started with the wrong equation. I don't think anybody's wrong. I don't think anybody is, regardless of your political outlook, political spectrum, whatever you want to call it, I don't think anybody's wrong. I just think that we have been taught and we have been messaged and we have been exposed to data that's incorrect, and we function our everyday lives based on that. So this anthology serves to give you some more data that's outside of what we have been taught. I think I went to 9 different school districts. I was exposed to a wide variety of Texas public school system, and I had my own basis of understanding. Now, I always knew something was wrong. I always looked around and I was like, I have this feeling that this is not how it's supposed to be. This is not what is real. And I think a lot of people right now are looking around and saying, what is going on here? There's something wrong. Life right now is not how I thought it was. It is different. A lot of people are saying to themselves, oh, I was wrong in some way. I have learned something new. I have learned something new that I would not have learned outside of COVID, where society was very disrupted and now we have all of this ongoing chaos. A lot of people are looking around saying, why are things so messed up? Because we're seeing the cracks. We're seeing protests. We're seeing the economy tank. We're seeing people dying. I mean, to be honest, all of these things have always kind of been happening, but I think COVID and social media have kind of made the perfect storm that people are more aware of things now. And this anthology serves to give you something to latch onto, maybe that is real. Because what policymakers do is real. Now, what they write in the bills might not be real, but their actions that they take, the things that they do, that actually happens. And it's in history, and it's all legal. That's the crazy thing to me. Sometimes I have to back up and I have to say to myself, it's all legal. Everything that anybody ever does is all legal. Does that mean that it is good for humans or for the place that we are? So humans make laws and we kind of rule the earth, right? So we make laws for us and the animals and the earth. We have established ourselves as the authority of the planet. Are the laws that people, humans, have made, are the laws reinforcing what is good, natural, real? Or are the laws reinforcing a system that allows humans to make money off of other humans? I know that I just said the punchline. I know I got there too early. But if you listen to these episodes, you might get to the point where you say, oh my God, everything that I see and I hear and I touch and I consume is not only not real, but it is there in order to make money off of me. Everything that I see is to make money off of me, and it's to make money for other human beings. So I would just like to point out, just to kind of circle back, humans do this to other humans. All of our problems, except for like natural disasters or if someone gets eaten by a bear, that happens. But for the most part, most of human misery is because of other humans, right? So that means that any decisions that we make, they could be made a different way. The things that we have decided are true don't have to be true. We construct our own reality. We are the authority of the planet at this point. We decide what is real. And so if we decide what is real, maybe we should decide to manifest the things that save lives. It may or may not save an economy, right? But does it save lives? Are we creating policies that result in positive outcomes for humans? Are there measurable outcomes for humans? The first episode is about money and how over the 20th century, money changed from being an intermediary to a vehicle by which humans could be exploited and enslaved at a level that has never been seen in history. And most of it has to do with reach. Most of it has to do with TVs being in every single living room, phones being in everybody's hands. The more reach you have, the more manipulation that you can do. And the people that are in charge, the people that make these policy decisions, the people that direct the policymakers to make those decisions, they understand humans. They understand the instincts, they understand the behaviors, and they understand how to manipulate those. Money and Power discusses what value is. It discusses the assumptions of our current system. And it discusses ways that we have been taught things that didn't include the full picture. So when we arrived at logical conclusions, we arrived at something that is invalid or that is not good for us because we didn't have all of the information that we needed to make those good decisions. Who are these decisions being made for if they're not being made for us, the voters, right? Thank you again for joining, and I really hope you enjoy the following with Dr. Paul Jorgensen.
What happened in class was, this was my spring semester of my freshman year of college. And I was an anthropology major, but I was taking political science and philosophy classes. The one anthropology class that I took was not as interesting to me as I thought it was going to be. And so I took political economy and I did really, really well in that class. I mean, I think I got a B, but the level, I think you had just come from a really, really good school. And the level that you were demanding from that class was completely unreasonable. It was not unreasonable for me because I was like, oh yeah, like challenge accepted. Because there were so many times, I mean, it was a screen class and there were so many times where I would look around the room and people would not have any idea what you were talking about. And it wasn't because, you weren't a bad teacher, none of those things. It was just that we had never heard anything like that before. Mm-hmm. And so we had no bearing to which to latch on to these things, because when we had learned about history and, just my school system did not prepare me to accept the information that you were telling me. But was that your first semester being there? I think it might have been.
Yeah, the second.
Okay, the second. I don't know if you remember me in class, but I remember asking a lot of questions and interrupting a lot because the material was dense. And again, it was something that we had never heard before. And I don't know if I feel like you liked the questions. Sometimes I'm sure that you were annoyed because you were interrupted. But the thing that I would like people to know about this class is Dr. Jorgensen did not tell us that anything was wrong or bad. He presented the information as accurately as he possibly could. And what he showed us was that the assumptions that we believe about the economy and about society and about how like human instincts and behavior, and there's a lot that goes into it, but a lot of our assumptions are illogical. Things don't add up. And throughout the semester, there was a couple of us that filtered out that were like, we would walk out of class and we would be like, did you guys hear that? Are you guys understanding? Like, did he really say, is this what he meant? Is this what is going on? It's like once you turn the page and you get to the other side, you can't really go back. I would like to give people the opportunity to hear this because, again, it was hard for me to access in college because I had never heard these things before. And so if I didn't hear them, and let me tell you, I think I went to like 12 different school districts. So and yes, it's all in Texas, but still like 12 different public schools. All right, maybe not 12, maybe like 9. But yeah, so where do you want to start?
Well, I think, we always want to start with assumptions, always. And, assumptions about what, but I would start big, right? Start with these big systems that we live in. So and these big systems tend to be so big that we don't often question them. But, right, given the housing crisis.
For example, big systems like the medical system, where we have doctors that go to medical school, and then once they're done with that, then everybody in the country trusts them to be able to make decisions life or death for them, right? Like that's an example of a structure or a system where we assume that the authority is correct or good for us or in our best interest, for that matter.
Right. So that is a big system. And I would even start even bigger, right? But certainly you're right. So that would be an example of a system of education tied to industry that affects everyone. The prison system would be another. But there's two big ones that are so big that, almost that metaphor of elephant in the room doesn't quite capture the largesse of
the impact.
Where I think people should start.
Yeah.
And people should start with economic system and political system. So, in the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 80s, there were classes offered at the university titled Capitalism and Democracy. And they would spend a whole semester on these two big systems. And, even before the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, there was a field of study called political economy. And after the turn of the century there, you had a divorce institutionally between political science and economics. And that divorce, people, I guess like myself, have been trying to put them back together. And it's very difficult to do, like you mentioned, in a particular class, in a particular semester. It's very difficult to put those two back together in 15 weeks. But that's what a lot of us now are trying to do. And that's what a lot of students are clamoring for, precisely because think of what we lived through in the past 10 to 15 years. The housing crisis, financial crisis, and then the social movements that responded to those crises, both on the right and the left, with Occupy and the Tea Party, funded much differently, of course. And then you're going to have, an economic growth period where no one shares in the gains of growth in GDP growth. So you have massive inequality, and then you have a public health crisis that is coupled with an economic fallout, which is going to be obvious, and that affects mostly the bottom 20% of income earners the worst. And then you have these political, not uprisings, but political movements on the right.
Crisis moments,
right.
Periods like catalysts, things that inspire politicians to act, for sure.
Right. So you have now, the curtailing of voting rights occurring across the United States. And so then
So what you're saying is we've had several economic events happen. And now we are seeing, in result, big political movements as well. So you're saying like the economy drives the politics and the politics drives the economy.
Right. And so we can pick a starting point in this circle, but you're never going to be able to get out of that cycle. So it was, politics that led up to the financial crisis. It was a crisis in political representation because a lot of policy was made to benefit the very institutions and financial institutions that brought down the economy. And then, you see some response policy-wise, but it was not enough. And we have experienced one crisis after another in the past 10 to 15 years. And then not to mention the big one, climate change. And so there's a point now when a professor is going to come in and say, let's question, and actually not even question, but just articulate the basic assumptions of our economic system and our political system to then see how these assumptions are faulty or maybe not as democratic as we would want. That kind of articulation and questioning isn't, I don't think, as radical anymore now in 2020, 2021. Maybe even after the financial crisis, it took a while for students to kind of move into a university system where this was occurring. But more and more now, I think people are being exposed, especially more and more younger people are being exposed to the articulation and questioning of the underlying assumptions in our economic and political system. So it seems a bit less radical to do that.
Oh, yeah. I'm seeing a lot of Gen Z questioning, like, just different social media posts, and it'll go viral of something like, we work so hard and we're so unhappy and we are isolated from our families, but we keep getting told life is just this hard and this is just the way it is. And they're saying, I don't think this is just the way it is. I think that this is being taught. We are being put into this. And nobody was talking about that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There were people on the fringe saying that, but when you hear that kind of information and you don't really, that's the first time you've heard it, of course, you're living in a system, you would automatically dismiss it as like, oh, whatever. But people are seriously questioning, what are we doing here? What are we spending our lives doing? And that, you're right. I think things are different right now.
Absolutely. And, different generations have suffered through crises, right? Whether it's World War, Vietnam War, Reaganism, right? So, neoliberalism and these big words that we can unpack. But
I like how you grouped in Reaganism with war and terror.
In many ways, both domestic and international, that's what it was.
But that's what we're here to show people is the fundamental assumptions of capitalism that Reaganism was built on. I mean, people go back to those in their arguments all the time and they use them over and over and over again, but they don't actually question if those are true. And so, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so let's unpack kind of this economic system. So entry textbooks, or you just, Google the definition of our economic system, and it typically is defined first with this characteristic of private ownership of private property, right? Of what some would call just the means of production. So when we say private property, we're not saying the shirt on my back. We're talking about the ownership of the capital or the machines and the ingredients of producing a final product. And those machines, for example, would be held in private hands in our economic system. And then the definition, your typical definition, then goes from that characteristic then to the market. So the market is defined this way: the voluntary and mutually advantageous trade of private property. So that's how we would define typically, capitalism. And so,
who defines it that way? This is our universally understood. It's self-driven, it's self-interested. It should move freely, and things should be allowed to fall off as they may because the market addresses all of those things, right?
Right. So, the notion of self-interest and then letting things fall where they fall, this laissez-faire attitude. So the self-interest would be an embedded assumption in how markets are driven. And then the laissez-faire approach of letting markets be markets would be an outcome or it would be a policy choice and saying that markets are best left to their own devices.
But that's not an assumption in of itself. So the laissez-faire part is not an assumption. It's a directional choice that has been made.
Right. So one could say it's an assumption, but it's empirically verifiable that it's just not true. And so then it becomes just a policy choice at that point, I think. But that definition where, you'll find that, embedded in the works of someone like Milton Friedman, an economist from the University of Chicago who really gained popularity in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. But it's in just your standard textbook. So textbooks will distill and crystallize certain pieces of information and leave out others, and that's what you're going to get. Now, what's interesting
I read Milton Friedman, and if you accept the assumptions that he starts with, his argument makes perfect sense. If you started, his starting line where you finish is very logical. The problem is his starting line is flawed, and that's the whole point.
Right. So we would politely say the assumptions don't hold, right? Or we could say it's ahistorical, which a lot of those
is like a lie.
Well, it doesn't recognize the mal and disproportionate distribution of wealth and goods prior to these starting points. So one can act self-interested, but if you have nothing, so what? It doesn't matter at that point. And so then where I think we should start with this definition is just understand that we can go through some of the assumptions that don't hold, but also, I think a good place to start would be, what is it leaving out, right? So the definition itself of our economic system, that it's predicated on voluntary, mutually advantageous trade of private property. Okay, so you got some assumptions there. Voluntary trade, mutually advantageous, right? Private property. But it's focusing on the circulation of goods, the exchange of them, okay? What it leaves out is the production process of those goods. So
what it takes to have a circle of goods happen.
Right. So if capital with an A, right? Capital is, we can think of it, if you're going to put on a bumper sticker, right? It's money used to make more money, okay? So then capitalism is a system of economic production and distribution based on that premise that we produce things to make more money. And then it requires a constant circulation of money and capital.
And we want to make more money because it is in our best interest to do so.
Well, yes, in theory, right? In theory. Now,
So why do you say in theory? So why is that because everybody would be like, well, you make more money, you get to provide for yourself, you get more opportunities, you have more freedom. Why would it not be in your best interest?
Because it's how we make the money is predicated on destroying the environment, for one. How we make money can be tied to why we go to war, for another. So if you just look at the household, yes, the idea is to make more money, but that's part of the reason why I think a lot of what you call Generation Z and a lot of younger people are saying, why am I doing this? There's an article in The Guardian the other day about younger folks, late 20s into the early 40s, working on Wall Street. And they work, 100 hours a week, right? And, they make a boatload of money. What is this doing to my life, right? So the old adage here is that if we could be as productive as we were in that, quote, golden age of capitalism, 1950s, and we could work 3 or 4 days a week, right? A max. And so then it's not always healthy continue to try to make money hand over fist. But there's another approach at kind of tackling my hesitancy to the statement, in that some of us live in an economic system where some of us will use money to make more money, right? Some of us will do that. We start with a pot of money, put it to use, make more money. And we could do that in various different ways. And that's in many ways what the definition of capitalism focuses on, is that you start with private property, you put it to use, and you make more money on the other side. But if we start to look at the production process and where most people fit in our economic system, right?
And you're literally saying most people as in the working class. This is
right. Like
how many 95% of the US population?
Most, in some way, shape, or form, are part of a production process, whether that's in service jobs or kind of the old style of industrial jobs. In some way, shape, or form, they are in some type of production process to produce a final good, whether or not that's, maintaining hotel rooms or, producing pencils or something, right?
Yeah, but this looks like a 40-hour plus a week job where they go somewhere, they spend their time, and then they leave.
Right. Yeah, excellent. And most people will do that, right? Now, do those folks live in the same type of economic system that allows them to trade private property for more money? And the answer is probably no, right? When you look at, the average savings rate in the U.S., it's not that far above zero, right? Most people don't save a lot of money. If they are able to save money, right, they're going to put it towards future spending. That could be these health savings accounts or these tuition accounts to save money to send your kid to school.
And you're not just saying that this is what it is. You're saying, and we can post resources to demonstrate, no, this is literally how savings go for people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's rather uncontroversial. I mean, the average net wealth.
But it is controversial because it's your choice what to do with your money, right? Like, if you're not saving it, that's not my problem. So what I'm trying to bridge the gap is, like, why are they not saving it? Are they saving it because they're spending it on PlayStations and sneakers? Or are they doing it, like, there's this rhetoric about, why people aren't doing as well as other people. And so there's a fundamental difference when you have capital to start with and when you don't have capital to start with, and the difference in decision making that you can do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if your father ran a bunch of real estate ventures and gave you $100 million loan in the late 70s, yeah, you could do something with that versus not. And, here we'll come back to the reason why the definition of our economic system must include production, because that's where the action is. And so then the answer to, well, why aren't people saving money, right, is because they're buying, big televisions, PlayStations, right? Are they consuming too much? And, yes, you're right. There's a debate there, and I don't think empirically it's much of a debate. But, one could look at it.
I love that.
Yeah, one could look at it from another point of view, right? Which is, what has happened to wages, since the 60s and 70s? And the answer is they haven't gone up for almost everybody, So then we keep working, but we're not actually making more money than we did in the 70s.
But wait, our economy is so much bigger. We are producing way more. Everything is more. You would think that if somebody is spending 40 hours a week at a job and they're producing X amount in the 70s and they made X amount in the 70s, you'd think that if they were producing 400 times that, which is what we're doing now, that you would make that wage. Now, the argument is, well, a lot of it's automated, and so it's not actual effort and it's not actual. But so can we talk about this? Can we talk about physical labor and effort and voluntary and?
Right. So, well, let's take these in steps, right? So there's
okay. All right.
So wages have flattened out, right? And there's lots of reasons for this. Not a lot. I mean, union membership has been declining, and there's been union busting efforts by state and federal governments over the last 40 years. And certainly that's part of the reason why wages are flattening out. One could argue that there's some level of automation, but that should mean if we all shared in the gains of automation, we would be working less, and we would be reaping actually more money and more free time at the same time. So automation isn't quite a decent argument for why you have unemployment or low wage jobs. What can happen is there's a level of automation that pushes workers into lesser skilled types of jobs, especially in the service industry and in retail. And there's a great book about this in the 1970s written by Braverman called Labor and Monopoly Capital. And he recognized, quite accurately, still to this day, it's a fairly accurate argument that as our economy is, more automated, how come the number one injury that causes missed work is our back injury? So as our economy becomes from blue collar to so-called white collar jobs, how come we're still missing a ton of work because we're doing back-breaking work? And he finds this argument that, as we become as certain people become more skilled, they start to be able to use their brains to make money. But what that does is it creates this polarized workforce where you have even more people who must only use their bodies for economic production. And so then if we're just going to...
So what you mean by that is when you have jobs that are more brain powered than physical powered, then certain people take up those kinds of jobs. Mm-hmm. And that means that the rest of the people have to take up the labor focused jobs. Mm-hmm. But that means that they're taking up labor focused jobs that don't use their brains very much. Right. And then vice versa. And then the people that use their brains, they don't do labor. And so why is this a problem?
Well, it's a problem in terms of, I think, human development, right? I mean, it's a problem in that how workers who do backbreaking work are treated, and the pay scales are different.
My favorite example that I like to tell people is, we used to make furniture as a craft. There used to be furniture stores where people would be in the back crafting furniture, and they would sell it, and people would have it for 50 years, 100 years. But now we have people that are in factories that do the same thing, the same small part of a thing over and over and over again from 9 to 5 forever. So they're not doing something that's skilled, right? They're doing something very simple. They don't have to learn the whole craft because the whole craft is much more expensive, right? You have to spend time learning that. You have to apprentice, you have to do all these things, and then you can sell it for very expensive. But there's not really a place in our economy for that, because the trend right now is to buy cheap things and we get to throw it away after it goes bad, and then we can just buy a new thing. So we've kind of shifted into this consumer aspect where we're demanding more cheap things. But what people aren't understanding is the production of the cheap thing is usually brainless physical labor. That's very, 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 very cheap. That is below the living wage, or what is below what is required to live in the society that we live in.
Mm-hmm. That's the point, right? And so then this goes back, right, to Adam Smith. So those who champion the economic system will typically resort to quoting lines out of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, at the beginning of his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, gives an example of the pin factory, P-I-N, right? A pin factory, making those little pins, and how, instead of one person doing it, you could have a whole slew of people do different aspects of the production process, and you can produce more. But then he recognizes exactly what you said. He recognizes it in 1776, that when you do this, right? When you have a division of labor in the production process and you delineate these very minute tasks, it can result in what Braverman called de-skilling. Right? You're going to de-skill these workers. Okay, now that can have enormous ramifications for humans and society, and especially the working class. First, right, the purpose for delineating these tasks is to create a hierarchical pay scale. So some of the more minute, mundane tasks, you pay a lot less. And, back not too long ago, you would have, children doing this. And this is, where you could, pay different people differently through wage discrimination based off of the division of labor. So then,
why do they want that? Why do they want this hierarchical scale?
So then, once we understand who they is, right, then
okay.
We know, because it's the owners of the means of production, right? So this is why when we just focus on the circulation of commodities to define our economic system, we're missing where the power is and where the power dynamic is. Because those who own the production, the capital, the machines, they then want to hire people to bring those machines to life. And when they do that
as cheaply as possible, because that's in their best interest to do so. I mean, they literally will, every single person that hires someone, unless they go by some other moral code. So say you work for an agency and it's a manager and a manager's hiring you and you're doing the negotiation. It's literally the manager's job to get that employee as cheaply as possible, because that's what's in the best interest of the company. Like that's just how how it goes across the board. That's so.
And
it
really doesn't matter if you're talking about someone who works, at a fast food restaurant or a retail shop, or the Wall Street example I gave out of the newspaper, right? Those people work 90 hours. Why? Because they're producing more value than they're getting compensated for. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. And there's multiple ways to extract more value than what they're compensated for. One, you can keep them there 90 hours a week, or you can speed up what they do, right? It's usually either or. So you keep them there longer.
I mean, I was in politics. We didn't get paid a lot, but the exchange was the power and the influence, because if you're next to an elected official, you have more power. I mean, you're literally writing the laws and you're putting through things through the committees, and those people have a lot of influence. And so if you do what you need to do, right, to be able to support yourself and to accomplish your goals. And so, of course, if you're the employee, you're accepting whatever you can get.
Right. But that's kind of the economic, side of it. And what Braverman and many, many, many others who came before and many who have come after recognize that the purpose of this division of labor is not just to de-skill to the point of developing a machine to do that very thing, right? But the other point is to ensure that working people don't have knowledge of the production process itself. So you have some cases where they might not even know what comes out at the end, right? And even if they do, they can't control every aspect of the process, like your example of the craft furniture worker, right? So what that does is it disempowers the worker. They
can't take what they have learned. They can't invest in themselves by working for this company and then be able to take that and be able to provide for themselves. They have no idea how to make a couch at the end of the day.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's true. But then some cases you'd be paid so little that you couldn't get the capital to do it. And this has gone global. So, we can focus on workers in the US, but we can also focus on workers in Southeast Asia or in these pharmaceutical plants, churning out pills. That is hard work. And, we think of like the pharma sector as being intellectual, right? A bunch of chemists and PhDs, but they rely on labor in lesser developed countries to produce those products, those pills, right? So then, even if you do have the knowledge, there's not a lot you can do about it without collectively, organizing. So by disempowering the worker, certainly, right? And Adam Smith wrote about this if you actually move through that large book, right? As you get, through it, he'll write about how these workers, as a result of the division of labor, aren't as intelligent as workers who came before, but also you can't control the production process that way, right? And so then it allows the owners of the means of production to better control the production process, right? And that would include a wage, but it also includes a lack of political power, disempowering the worker that way, and certainly a loss of skills.
And you mean disempowering by so this is really interesting. So my grandfather, who died when my dad was 11, he was the president of his union up in Iowa. And I don't know a ton about it, but I do know that there were several strikes, there was all kinds of things that was going on in Iowa. But the reason that they were able to do that is because they had a bunch of like-minded people that had this. I don't know if it was because of the kind of immigrants that moved in. It was a lot of, Germans and Scandinavians so the culture was different. But if you take away the skill of it, if you take away the training, if you take away the ability for people to leave that factory, they don't, especially if it's a small town and there's only one big manufacturer in that place. If you don't have farmland, or if you don't have any other way to provide for yourself or to feed for yourself, you don't have any other choice but to work at that place. And you have to be okay with accepting the consequences of that, or you can leave. And that's what people always say. Well, if you don't like it, you can leave. Okay, well, my family has lived here for generations. I have no support anywhere else, financial support, right? Because you need money to be able to do anything in our lives. So basically, you have people stranded in, it's basically, adult daycare of you go somewhere and you're producing money for somebody else. It's literally, and the owners of production, yes, they run their businesses, but now we have huge corporations where you might own your business, but you have a whole staff that takes care of that. And now that income is passive and you do nothing. And maybe you did work so hard to make your business that big, but it's a rare story. Yes, we can point anecdotally to people that were self-made and that, created this wonderful empire out of nothing. But at the end of the day, the people that have all the power are the people that have the money to start the businesses. And if you're smart, you're going to start a business in a place where you're dependent on it because it provides your food, or you're dependent upon it because it provides your energy. It's not voluntary.
Absolutely.
Capitalism is about voluntary everything, but the whole labor is not voluntary. If you are a person in the United States, you must get a job, you must make money to be able to survive. That's it. It's not voluntary. So if it's not voluntary, then what does that mean now? If we're doing involuntary labor, what is that? What is another word for involuntary labor?
Well, in capitalism, you can call it a wage slave, as one person has.
I was going to use the S word too. I was going to use the slavery word as well.
So you bring up some interesting points. So when you work in a town, like you mentioned in Iowa, and then you kind of extrapolate from that example, and you correctly recognize that most of the U.S. workforce works for the largest corporations in the country, right? So then, what we have there, you have a lot of people focused on monopoly power, and rightfully so.
And they work for the biggest corporations because the corporations are the ones with the capital to be able to go into these towns and to be able to build a Walmart or to build gas stations or whatever it is that the corporations come in.
They often get a bunch of tax breaks to do it, so they have actually towns competing against each other.
Tesla just showed up an exit down.
Right. Yeah.
They were courted. They were seduced.
Yeah, you have, Amazon warehouses, and Amazon headquarters is the famous example. But you have actually just run-of-the-mill examples every day, whether or not you're building a Bass Pro Shop or whatever you're building, Crate and Barrel, whatever you want to call it, they compete by putting one local government against another to try to lower taxes. And then what that isn't necessarily just monopoly power. It's actually, when it comes to labor relations, which is what you're focusing on, it's called monopsony power, right? And this is something that doesn't get a lot of it. I don't think gets enough attention. So monopoly power is over production, suppliers, right? We have one supplier that can manipulate price through the manipulation of quantity. Monopsony power is a single buyer. Now, this is relatable because the firm is a purchaser of labor, right? So if you only have a single buyer, only a collection of different buyers of labor, that gives them power to manipulate the price. And the price of labor is the wage. So then the response by some is saying, if you don't like it, leave, get another job.
Can you say that again? Okay, so it's a monopsony because there's one buyer. What does that mean? There's one buyer.
So, think of an old company town like the one you just allowed us to imagine in Iowa, where you have one employer. That's one purchaser of labor, one buyer
Gotcha.
of workers. And you have these towns, you're not the same in the same sense, but you have some places like this throughout the United States. And then when you look writ large, if we all most of us end up working for the largest corporations, and you say, I don't like this, I'm going to go somewhere else. There's not actually a lot of leverage that workers can have to leverage a higher price for their labor because there's so few buyers of labor, right?
Yeah, so example of things that people can use for leverage is experience and more skills and expertise, say. But what we're saying is that is what has been taken out of the labor force is that expertise that people can use to demand more wages. Because if you have a job that it doesn't matter how qualified you are, you still have to do this very simple thing, and it doesn't require any training, you're not going to pay somebody more just because they can do it better. Yeah. You're going to pay them the same. There's no promotion to go to. It's right. You can turn this or not. And that's not an expertise.
Right. And this happens for a lot of folks. And one response would be, well, go back to school, get retrained, get another job. And this can happen, right? People do this. And one would argue that the reason why you keep these menial jobs low wage is because it provides an incentive for people to go back to school and get trained to do something else. But that works only very minimally when you think of all the costs that one has to incur to go back to school, to get retrained. And it's all on them. There's not a robust governmental policy that allows people this flexibility. And so another way that workers can have leverage isn't just what they do individually, which is very hard, if not impossible to do. It's collectively. What could be done to give workers more leverage? In other words, more power. And that would be a full employment policy. If we actually had a full employment policy in the United States, you would see wages go up. Absolutely. That's why we don't have one.
Okay. And what does unemployment mean?
Unemployment means that there's always the threat of being replaced. That's where the lack of political power comes from, so to speak, in that there's always going to be a threat of, if you raise your voice at the workplace or you try to unionize, you try to then do that and you try to actually extract some political power or put some pressure on the employer and say, look, there's 5% of people out there that don't have a job who's been willing to retake yours and for this price. So see you later. So then that's always the threat of unemployment. So then a full employment policy would take that threat away, and there'd be more freedom to move jobs and to search for higher wages.
I feel like there's two strokes that I'm trying to communicate to people. And the harder stroke is we need to be living in extremely, and I'm talking extremely small communities where there's no police and nobody is ever in control of anybody else. Everybody is accountable to their own people and, blah, blah, blah. That's like my hard stroke. That's obviously like, okay, that's not going to happen. But the softer stroke is, how are people going to be, so how can people spend their days happy and with joy? Because at this point, it's well known that we produce enough food to feed we produce a lot of the world's food. We produce so much that we can feed us plus most of the other world, or, like 40% of the world or something like that. And so if we can feed everyone and we have machines that can do the labor anyways, we're still sending people to work every day to do something, right? And there's the service industry. I would like to make an argument that the service industry is so vast today because we literally were trying to create more jobs, and creating more jobs gives it gives people more freedom because it gives people more cash, but it also gives more people the ability to make money because there's profit to be made there. And so at what point do we all look around and say, like you mentioned before, we could be doing in 3 days what we were doing in the 50s, the amount of production. And at what point do we look around and say, the time that I'm spending every day is not making me happy? And of course, people are like, well, life is hard and, you just have to, but I would just like to challenge that we're working until we can get retirement and we can get our really nice pensions and our really nice things. But even that there used to be some power with the labor force because people unionized, and there's an episode all about this. But at some point things started to change where we didn't have any power, and we didn't have any power forever. My dad likes to say this. He goes, Shauna, I watched this movie once. I think it's a Mark Wahlberg movie. And he goes, this old guy tells Mark Wahlberg, he goes, at some point, son, you got to get to a point where you can tell everybody to go fuck themselves or something, or something like that, where you can walk away from everybody and say, I don't need any of this. I have the freedom to do whatever I want, and you guys can go fuck yourselves. And I would just like to say that message to everyone in America, because money equals freedom. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a lot of money, you are subject to a lot of constraints around. So if you're only making $12 an hour, you're only making enough to cover your rent, your food, your gas, your utilities, and maybe a couple, maybe you go out a couple times a week or, something like that. But that's basically what your life is. And if you're in a job where you can't make any more unless you go to school, well, okay, maybe you have enough money to apply for state funding in order to go to school. So maybe you're good enough to get all of this free tuition, but you still have to be working. You still, what if you have kids at that point? So you graduated from high school, you start working at a factory, you're encouraged to get married. So, you got married. That's what life is about. You got some kids, you're still making $12 an hour. How do you go to school? How does that person go to school? That is overcoming a lot of hardship in order to do that. Whereas me, I had two parents that were college educated, and all I had to do was just grab the light and say, yes, I will do this. And I will show up to school and I will get a 3.25 GPA without doing hardly any work. And you can just say this, Shauna did very little work in college. And now I can provide for myself. I think my last salary was $52,000 a year, and that came out to about $27 an hour. And that is something that I can provide for myself with. And I didn't have to do all of those things. I didn't have to go to night school. After working 8 hours, I didn't have to go to night school. I didn't have to send my kids to daycare where God knows what happens to them. Anyways, the whole point, I wish people would stop saying just work harder.
Right. So we already,
That's it.
work pretty hard. We work long hours. And then, we keep telling ourselves that, we might live in a meritocracy or somehow the American dream is still alive. But what the point you just raised, which was, in the broader view, what's the greatest predictor of your income? And the greatest predictor of your income isn't necessarily, your choices, it's your parents' income. And this is happening for more and more families in the United States, where that's the greatest predictor. And so there's a couple ways to go about this in order to correct it. You could try to put leverage and push for policies that help correct this, because policies have changed in the last 40, 50 years to get to this state that you're speaking of. But also it's correct to recognize that, life has never been that great for everyone. And so then there's things that one could try to do in the workplace to try to improve their situation. So you said that, right now, right, money equals freedom, but only in an economic system that we live in could allow someone could say that, right? I mean, that's crazy. That could be said, but given where we are, that's actually true.
Yeah, so I said money is freedom so casually.
Yeah.
I guess not everybody knows that. Or if they have heard that before, they don't really know what it means. But if you really sit down and think about it, the more money you have, the happier you are. Because you have the free time, you have the mental clarity. If you have the money, you can buy 10 generators when the power goes off. And you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to go to your cousin's house. You don't have to start burning wood in the backyard. No. You had this. They had extra money this month. Why wouldn't they buy it? Or if you're even more rich, then you can go take a vacation during the winter storm so that you can avoid the unpleasantries altogether. And in fact, you can pay your staff to go take care of your place.
Mm-hmm.
So
and your little white dog too.
And your little white dog too.
Mm-hmm.
So do they deserve that? Maybe. Some of them do, right? Some of them deserve the ability to do that. But the question is, and this is what we get back to, and this is what you say is missing from the assumptions of voluntary choices and freedom of movement, is at what cost? Like, at what cost is the standard of living this high? At what cost do these people have the freedom to make these big choices with their money? And then the next point is if they have freedom to make choices with their money, why would they not make choices with their money that makes them more money? Why would they not go to the government and say, we want this to be done, and let us know what you need to make that happen, and we can make that happen for you? And I'm not going to share my personal experiences in politics at this time, maybe sometime in the future, I don't know. But I can tell you that I have seen this happen. And with my own two eyes, people talk about it all the time. Oh, the corrupt politicians and all those things. But what really is happening is a rich person is making a choice, a policy choice that affects the country. Like, this is federal, or this is state, or this is local. There's a lot of things in local government that people, I would argue that stuff is even wilder than, more wild than federal stuff. But they take that influence and they're making a decision for so many people. And the question is yeah, maybe you earned that money, but you didn't earn the impact that it causes. And why wouldn't they make those things happen? It's in their best interest.
Right. In fact, some would even resort to using their shareholders as the reason why. So it's set up saying that upper level management and even some ownership has to make decisions about the business that are to the benefit of shareholders. So then one makes an argument that, being involved in politics could, be very beneficial to shareholders. Building, plastic plant in Louisiana can be very beneficial to shareholders, no matter what the surrounding community suffers as a result from that. And so this is exactly why we'd want to focus on, systemic incentive structures and rules that govern people's lives, because those can actually be changed. And it doesn't matter if the rich person in your example is benevolent or not. They're going to do what they're going to do in order to make money for the shareholders. That's their job. And so it doesn't make much sense. I never thought it made much sense to, round up some folks and throw them in jail for the financial crisis or anything like that, because who are they going to be replaced with? The same person, more or less, right?
Yeah, I don't mean to keep making sports references because I don't know if this is my audience, but I'm not hating the player.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hating the game. I'm hating the structure. People are just, this is the rules of the game. Everybody is following the rules. And if part of the rules is that you get to do illegal shit until you're caught, then that's what the rules are,
Right.
And so people, of course, will do that. Why would they not?
Mm-hmm. Right. And
that's how you play the game.
Right. And there are models out there for different ways of living. And, without getting too utopian, one could actually just focus on, some, mechanisms to try to, even things out a bit. And there's actually good policy ideas out there, good stuff that has already passed actually the U.S. House of Representatives that we
like
can
what?
look.
What are your favorites?
Oh my gosh. Right now, a couple debates are taking place on what's called HR 1, the first bill they passed, which is they did it the last session too, and now this time with a non-Republican controlled Senate. I think that maybe they can pass this bill called HR 1, which is supposed to solidify an expansion of voting rights and try to, on the fringes at least, curtail some of the more excess money in politics, trying to eliminate what is called dark money, where we don't know the original source.
So how are they doing this? Is it more regulation? Are they starting a committee? Are they doing an oversight board? Like, what are they doing to address it? I would like to know how effective this bill would actually be, is my question.
Well, it doesn't eliminate money from politics. It doesn't lower the voting age to 16 or anything like that, although people tried to get that amendment in there. But there's some very basic things that would, stop the trend in a lot of states, which just happened in Georgia yesterday, where there's all these ridiculous policies that were just signed by the governor in Georgia about, not being able to provide food and water to people standing in line to vote, requiring photo ID for a mail-in, ballot, right? And these are the type of excesses that HR 1 would curtail. And then on the money and politics side, very specifically, there's been a long-standing piece of legislation that is yet to be signed by a president called the Disclose Act. And the Disclose Act would require the publicizing of all donors into a political entity. And this would require then the IRS to receive, and then also disclose donors into these nonprofits. So right now, the IRS does not have to collect the donors into these nonprofits, as long as these nonprofits spend about 50% of their budget on non-election related items. But and there's debates about this, whether that should happen or not. But that's certainly a kind of good government type of piece of legislation. But it would also, try to limit some money in politics, in part by providing incentives for small donation fundraising for U.S. Congress. That has never happened. So then, while it doesn't solve all of our political problems, people need to just kind of focus, I think, on what's actually happening, what is currently possible. Because if some of these things pass, you can lay what is called the condition for possibility for future changes. And then I think another important piece of legislation is called the PRO Act, and it also passed the House. And that's an acronym for, protecting your right to organize. It is a substantial piece of pro-labor legislation. In fact, every Democrat but one voted for it in the House. The one who didn't is in South Texas, Cuellar. And 5 Republicans voted for it. And this would offer a litany of things that would be pretty much pro-worker. And now, when you think of the unionization rate, our membership rate in unions in the United States is in between 10 and 11%. Right? That's anemic. It used to be
that's very small. Do you, on the top of your head, know like any European numbers? Like can we contrast that with something?
Well, I think not recent numbers, no, but certainly you're going to see 20, 30%, I think, in other countries. Somewhere like Canada hasn't had the same kind of decline. There has been declines because neoliberalism and this idea that unions shouldn't exist, isn't just tied.
Because it disrupts the flow. That's why they shouldn't exist.
Yeah. So if you're a corporation, you kind of see your profit rates declining. One of the quickest ways to correct for that is to lower your wage bill, pay less wages. For sure.
And that's where we see the massive layoffs for anybody, like huge layoffs, like Amazon layoffs or Dell layoffs of 2007, 2008. Mm-hmm. Profits are going down, but businesses go down all the time. Like Enron, there were like a whole lot of people that lost everything in their lives because this business went down. And you got to ask yourself, like, okay, so we're okay with the freedom of movement and we're letting things fail. But then we start to not let things fail. In 2008, we bail everybody out. But that just means that it removes more control, because then it means that no matter what the businesses, even if they don't do very well, the businesses will retain their power.
If they're big enough.
Yeah, if they're big enough. So what did we miss?
So I think we understand now that the production process and the relations in the production process are really crucial to focus on, because that shows power distinctions between the owners of the production process and capital and the workers, right? And I think that has been diagnosed. And then the inequality that emanates from that power differential. So then as wages flatten out and productivity grows, workers don't share in those productivity gains. And that's been shown, time and time again. So then if we go through some of the basic assumptions of our economic system, such as voluntary trade and mutually advantageous trade, we see that those don't often hold up. And the environment is, I think, front and center in a lot of people's minds on this. So when we produce things, they're called commodities most of the time, right? And they are produced in a way that creates effects on people and our environment that didn't voluntarily agree to the production or to the transaction. So there's a lot that happens in our economic system that is not voluntary. We can talk about, the wage contract and workers, which you did, but also in the circulation and sale of commodities, there's a lot that happens that is involuntary, and pollution and the emission of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, you're talking about construction, you're talking about transportation, you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the idea so we can get to some industries for sure. I mean, the list is long, but the idea of our economic system is that the price is reflective of the true cost. Okay. So when buyers and sellers voluntarily exchange goods on a market, and the idea there is that that produces the correct price of the exchange, and the price is going to measure the true cost. And that isn't true. And the price of many transactions can be too low because it doesn't reflect the true cost of what the transaction does to other people's health and the environment. And so when you have oil and gas extraction the way that you have it, or just existence of it, but then you add the hydraulic fracturing on top of that, that then creates an economy on the foundation of emitting carbon dioxide. Now, there's also different kinds of pollution that one could discuss, but it's carbon dioxide that is the major problem when it comes to climate change. And GDP growth and energy use are tightly intertwined, what we call tightly coupled. Scholars have shown this correlation to be near 100%. So as GDP goes up, our energy consumption goes up. Now, if our energy consumption is predicated on oil and coal, right, that means that as our economy grows, we emit more carbon dioxide. And that is having an awful, what we call in economics, a third-party effect, which is not only on the environment, but other people's health and future populations.
So you're saying because of how our economy is set up, energy is something that we need for survival. We live in places that are too hot and we live in places that are too cold. Mm-hmm. We need power to make food because we have separated ourselves from our food. It's made somewhere else. They need power to make it there. So our relationship to it is, so what you're saying is it's linked to the size of our, so our energy consumption is linked to our economy's growth, mm-hmm. right? And if capitalism has to keep growing in order to survive, which it does, it has to keep growing. That means our energy needs to keep growing as well. So which goes first? We don't know. It's very similar, I guess, to the political and economy. So as this goes up, though, the incentives are to keep producing more oil. Well, if you keep producing more oil, it's finite, right? Money is infinite. We can print more. We can put more in the system. Oil is not. This is a hard thing that we're pulling out of the ground, but it's tied to money. And so if you have something that is finite being tied to something that is infinite, then I'm seeing a huge problem here.
Well, peak oil, people debate, how much is left and that kind of thing. I mean, so the key point here, right, and you raise a really good issue, is that use the money, and I'd love to talk about that, right, in order to keep the oil in the ground. Don't use it. There's now it's old. I mean, ecological economists would always say the best place to store oil is in the ground, right? You don't need to extract it. Okay, so then to go back to what you said is that our economy needs to grow. I mean, that's kind of the mindset, I think, a lot of people working in the economy, and certainly of politicians and policymakers, is that growth becomes the economic policy goal.
Because that is what makes our standard of living better. Everybody will get out of poverty and everybody will be happy because our economy will finally grow to the point where it can sustain everybody at the levels they want to be sustained at.
Right. So then you grow yourself out of your problems. But then you come back to where we started, right? Which is, you mentioned Generation Z, and I think even older folks would recognize this, is that we're not sharing in the gains of growth, and growth is killing us and our future families.
So we're asking the question, at what cost?
Right. At what cost
does this growth happen?
Ourselves. And what's really quite striking is how many people are starting to be made aware of this. Not because it's just their real life experience. We have politicians telling us to die for the economy, right? We had
yes. Dan
yeah,
Patrick, he said I would rather die than let the economy die. So you're literally putting dollars. So if we're gonna rank things, that means that dollars are over lives. That's
yeah,
very
absolutely.
interesting because I'm pretty sure that money is imaginary.
So, all that's happening is that it's finally being said out loud. I mean, this has always been there,
Yeah.
for centuries. But now it's like being told to us that, yes, this is in fact the Hunger Games economy that we all thought we lived in, right? So then there's an attempt here to think and do things to avoid this catastrophe. And I think the public health crisis has opened a window of opportunity, so to speak, to do some of these things and to use money from the federal government, which, as a result of the bailouts in 2008 that you mentioned, and as a result of these COVID checks, right, that keep being pumped out, everybody knows now that the federal government can solve problems using its financial resources. It's not like the federal government sat around and scratched their heads and said, well, what kind of taxes are we going to raise before we spend? No, not at all. They said, we need to spend as fast as we can, right? Now, what that means in political terms is they took, 8 months to do this, but they still did it, okay? And that COVID bill was quite spectacular, in my opinion. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff in there, like the child credits, basic income for children, right? Or you can think of some people have phrased it as Social Security from starting at birth, right? And you get this check. It's amazing. And there is reason to be optimistic, but we have to follow through. Okay, so then we can use the financial capabilities of the federal government, but the climate crisis is obviously global. So then other countries and other economic regions that have the same financial power as the United States, China, Japan,
#Hunger Games,
right? They need to use their financial resources in the same way to decouple fossil fuel usage from economic growth.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what, like, I mean, all of the oil market is traded on the US dollar. I mean, all of that control that the United States has over the rest of the world. And I mean, again, when you have that much power, then your influence is far reaching.
There's movement on this, not to the extent that some would want, but there's different solutions to the climate crisis. One would entail just shrinking your economy, but I would guard against that mindset. It's called the Degrowth Movement, where we must shrink our economy to live more sustainably. And these folks acknowledge this, that can't happen with some kind of massive redistribution of wealth, because once you start shrinking your economy,
these big players have such big slices of the pie. And if you make the pie smaller, then you're really edging out everybody else.
Right. It's insane. I mean, you would see eco-fascism boil over in that if you do nothing and just say, have some sort of negative growth policy. So that, I don't think that's good. But there are some smaller ideas within the degrowth movement that are worthwhile to follow through on. And some of them entail what's called work sharing. So we want full employment and we can work less, right? And so we should do that. And another idea is more common consumption, where, this can work really in transportation, I think most effectively, where we share in our transportation. So instead of having to purchase a car to move around, which is private consumption, you do more public consumption. And while it could be ride sharing in an electric vehicle, fine, but mainly public transportation would probably be the way to go.
Well, so I mean, there's one option where you and your neighbors can get a bus. You all can throw in 2,000 and buy a really nice bus and do that, or your whole community puts in $200 and you get 16 buses. But when you start doing that, then again, the bigger that it gets, the more power and influence they get, because whoever owns the buses gets to decide what they do with it. If you have a lot of people contributing to it, not everybody wants to participate. And so then you have somebody that's making the decisions for all those people, as in where the buses go, what time they go there, how often they are, all of these things. So,
well, this is one of the reasons why defenders of the status quo are so afraid of climate change regulation. And this is well documented, by the way, by Naomi Klein. And her great book on this subject is called This Changes Everything. And that is true. The climate change and the attempt to stymie the nasty effects of climate change will change everything if we do it right. In fact, the only way to curtail climate change is to do it right. And that would entail different types of economic relationships. In other words, our economic system has to change, right? And there must be much more cooperation over self-interest and competition. There must be a lack of hierarchical relationships within a producing firm, right? For lots of reasons. You must have much more democracy, not, through elections, right? So the United States has mastered this, myth of democracy means more elections. But the irony is you don't get to make that many important decisions with all these elections, right? Mm-hmm. So then democracy has to happen where we spend most of our time, which is at work.
At work. Yeah.
Right. And lots of people have written on this.
Or where we live. And I live in a suburb, and I can tell you, I'm very controlled here. I don't get to do whatever I want. I own this property. I own I guess the bank owns the house, but I own the property. I don't get to do anything. I mean, yeah, I get to paint sometimes and stuff, but I wanted to have chickens out here. They wouldn't let me do it. I wanted chickens because I have a garden, and I was like, fuck capitalism. I'm going to make my own food. Not allowed to. Right. Why? Right. Why? Because people don't want chickens around. Why don't they want chickens around? Because they have to work in the morning. They don't want the roosters to wake them up before they have to drive themselves 45 minutes into town and then spend 8 hours at a place where they hate. And then they come home and they're supposed to be nice to their kids or to their spouses or to anybody.
So this is what's interesting about some recent policy ideas is that if we can create renewable energy as the major source of our energy, and eventually it has to be the only source, and very quickly it has to be the only source, that can open up a range of possibilities. Now, it doesn't have to go this way, but we could fight for it to go this way, which is...
Well, if it was renewable, it wouldn't be on the market, right?
Exactly. You do it yourself. And
why would you have it on the market? If it's sustainable and you can manage it yourself, why would you put that up to somebody else? Why would you exchange anything?
Right. So energy doesn't have to be a commodity. So yeah, that's exactly right. And people who don't want climate change regulation, we can point to, these industries like railroads, coal, oil as saying, we don't want it because this kills our industry. Okay. But there's a broader, I think, movement against climate change regulation because they realize that this becomes a problem for our economic system. Because if we're actually going to, prevent the nasty effects of climate change, this gives much more power, political power, to the rest of us. And that's part of the reason why it's such an uphill battle. I think in doing this, it comes back to just, political power. I mean, people want to always say it's always about profit, but profit and political power, go hand in hand. And so there are attempts now, right? And really in the last 10 years, this has gained a lot of traction to view the financial capability of the U.S. federal government as a common resource. So money coming from the federal government doesn't have to be scarce, right? No reason for it. There's no reason to have high interest rates, right?
What do you mean by it doesn't have to be scarce? What does that mean?
So there's two basic sources of money for us, households and businesses throughout the economy. One is to get cash in the form of a loan from a bank. And then you got to scramble around then to work, many hours to pay that off plus interest. Okay? Now that's where the bank would make money. And there's room for that in an economic system. And then the other source of money is from the federal government. And this is where I think with the public health crisis, people are starting to see this now as a power. So when private banks become the main source of money in an economic system, it's artificially scarce. The availability of money is artificially scarce because they're going to only make decisions about lending money in the expectation that they can make money in ensuing time periods, right? So
they have an incentive to lend the money because they can make money off of it.
Right. But they're going to be very careful. In some instances, that can grow an economy. In other instances, the banks are going to be overextended and they're going to then withdraw their lending capability and not lend. So when household debt increases to a level that makes banks uncomfortable, they're not going to lend as much money. And so if they see more and more people as being not having the ability to pay back that money over the course of the loan at a particular interest rate, they're either going to call for higher interest rates or withdraw that loan that they would otherwise offer. And so then that then can create this notion of scarcity among us about money. And
depending on the household debt and other factors, but it's depending on a bank's willingness to lend money to other people. That is a level of control. If we did not inherit capital, if we can't source it from amongst our communities, we have to go to apply for it at a bank.
Mm-hmm.
And if this is a time and place where the banks have higher requirements or lower requirements, you may or may not be able to get that started for yourself.
Right.
Okay. Got it.
And even if you get the loan, there's still a notion that money is scarce because you're saddled with that debt and you got to work and pay it back. And even the same for businesses too, where the bank is pretty much a leech on their profits. So they drain some of those profits away. So you're always having to work to pay it back. And that's why people would argue, some economists argue that when banks lend money, they're not actually creating any net financial wealth because everything that they lent goes back to the bank plus interest. So no net financial wealth is created over the life of the loan. So when you're paying back that loan, you're basically deleting digits out of your bank account, and that money you never see back, right?
So we're counting it as a +1, but really it's a -1 and goes back to 0.
Right.
But we've been counting it as a +1.
It's a +1 for the bank. It's a -1 for
right.
you. And then those net each other out.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
Oh, yeah. So they're on different levels of the thing. So it's going like this. That's
right.
weird.
It's accounting 101. And so a bank's asset is another's liability.
Mm-hmm.
So then that becomes a problem for us if that's the dominant source of money. So then the federal government is the other source. Now, the federal government has policies to curtail bank lending. So when banks lend money, they lend us the exact same looking dollar that is produced by the federal government because the federal government is the only one that can actually print that money and create the digits. So then federal policy, this is why the Federal Reserve exists, is promote or curtail bank lending as a matter of policy. And they do that by targeting particular interest rates. But the federal government can decide to spend money directly. And it does this in a lot of different ways, through grants, through grants to businesses, grants to universities, grants to faculty, or they can just buy something. So they could then what's called the procurement process, these federal contracts. The entire defense industry is basically a welfare recipient, right? So the federal government buys missiles, buys the people to make the missiles. So the federal government then can buy anything it wants as long as we're willing to sell what we have to the government to get dollars. As long as we're willing to get dollars and receive dollars for what we produce, the federal government can buy anything it wants. So pretty much all of its bonds are denominated in the dollar, right? And then the federal government can then, since it's has a monopoly on the supply of dollars, which is tightly controlled, counterfeiters are, locked up for quite a long time. And then their debt, their so-called debt, what they owe others, what the federal government owes others, is denominated in the very currency that it controls.
Yeah, debt held in U.S. dollars means that we control what the value of that debt is.
Mm-hmm. And there's no
because we decide what the dollar is worth.
Yeah, it's a matter of policy that sets the interest rate on the dollar. And so then the main point is that it's not difficult for the federal government to pay off a bond. It's just not. That's why the United States doesn't default on bonds like other countries do, or states or counties do. And so then the federal government has a lot of power, financial power, and it's not financially constrained to solve problems. So the whole idea here is to teach as many people this basic concept. And people know this, it's intuitive because they live it, they experience it. And we know this because public opinion polls show that the broad American public doesn't care about the U.S. debt, right? There's lots of propaganda out there to tell people the debt is bad. There's a whole debt clock that gets circulated around, intro classes.
We had a debate with you and some person from the economic department, I think, when I was at school. I don't remember. This is like all in a.
Yeah. So there was a lot.
That was fun.
There were minds changed that day, I think. and that was probably one of the great moments. I think that's what university is supposed to do, and we don't live up to that.
Oh my God. I just remembered we had a couple memes of you and they were all about like capitalism and profit and corporations and oh, I remember now. It was you had a Starbucks cup or something and we were like, oh, so like sell out or so, I don't know. I don't remember, but it was, if anybody becomes a fan of Dr. J, like the rest of us have become, I'm going to share some of these things online.
Yeah, I saw some of those, and it's funny, but and like we've been saying, you can't really divorce yourself from relying on some corporate entity. Like even now,
right? It's extremely difficult to avoid it. It's right. Everywhere. It's in fact, people are punished for not buying these things or doing these things, or they make it extremely difficult to not stay on the path. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm buying a trailer and leaving this place.
Yeah, and even the trailer will come from a corporation. So then...
that's true.
So then... but just because one, consumes products from corporations doesn't mean you can't criticize their practices, right? So then, that's funny.
That's right. I'm going to tell every single Starbucks employee, listen, oh, actually, this is very funny. I was at Wells Fargo and I'm basically asking them to take all the fees off of my account because I'm like, you capitalistic assholes. No, but I was obviously being very nice because I'm begging them to take the fees off. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm starting a podcast. And they're like, oh wow, what's your podcast about? And I was like how money isn't real, but it controls us and formed our reality. And the teller was like, girl, yes, like all this corporate, it was just so funny because it was the teller at Wells Fargo. And he was like, and it controls us all. And I was like, right? Anyways.
Yeah. And what's interesting, though, is that what people are trying to do is convince us it's the other way around. We actually control the money.
Yeah, human beings control the money. That's right. There's no like totem in the sky of a market where this like the money goes into heaven and lives there and then trickles down to us. No, that's not what happens.
No.
It's human beings that are pushing all the buttons and putting all the numbers in. I used to be one of those people. The state government spent money on the Department of Public Safety, and I put those numbers in there.
Right.
Where did we get those numbers? From oil and gas, from the Railroad Commission. And we chose exactly how much oil to take out of the ground.
Right. And those numbers at the state level eventually have to be found again. But for Texas, like a lot of states, they get their money mainly from the federal government and the sales tax.
That's right.
So, and then certainly, when there's power outages caused by the government and hurricanes that are, indirectly caused by our activities,
we get federal crisis money.
Right. And you almost have politicians in Texas begging on TV for that money. And they always want to be seen.
And what happens is there will be something that's in the state budget that they can replace with these funds. And then this ties up more money for them to put in other places. And sometimes they'll talk about it and tell people what that is. And most of the time they won't.
Right. That's right. And the federal government's caught on and is trying not to allow, certainly the last COVID bill, they don't want states plugging holes in their budget with it. And there's rules against that. Because that's how a lot of welfare money, I think, was used. You take the money and you plug, and you allow for tax cuts in order to plug other budget holes as a result of tax cuts with.
That's right. Property tax. Yeah. Property tax cuts usually. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And even Texas, property taxes are regressive, which is just, amazing. Texas has turned regressive taxation into an art form.
I think I'm going to put a property episode in. I just think the discussion of private property and like land use and all of those things, I think it's just so fundamental to the zoom out things that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I reached out to somebody that would be perfect, but he hasn't been responsive. So I think I need to find somebody else for property. But yeah, it's just, there's so much land that's owned by corporations. There's so much land that's owned by foreign countries. There's so much land that is owned by business owners that use their land for business.
Mm-hmm.
And, all of that's fine. I'm sure they worked for it or they inherited it or whatever. But at the end of the day, like that's all land that people could be using to provide for themselves. But instead they have to live in cities or near places where they can go work for something to get money to pay for food instead of making the food themselves or providing for themselves. And somebody was like, do you know what it takes to garden? And I'm like, I mean, kind of. I would rather spend my day gardening than working and making money for somebody else. And I know that not everybody is like that, but we have the infrastructure to account for all of that stuff.
Yeah.
We've built everything that we needed to build to be able to feed everybody.
Yep.
We don't even have to do the thing where everybody has plants in their backyard.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, there's attempts, urban gardening and these sorts of things that are happening in a lot of different cities. And there's an expert here at our university about this, and a few on food and gardening, kind of large scale food production in urban areas. Yeah, that's a very important topic. Yeah, that's worthwhile.
Yeah. Okay, so what else? What are we missing? What have we not talked about?
I mean, we covered, I think, the basic argument on, the pitfalls of capitalism. I mean, if you had any specific questions on that.
No, I mean, we talked about this. We talked about the Federal Reserve. We talked about labor. We talked about welfare and slavery. And yeah, I mean, I think we have strings to everything that I'm going to talk about in the anthology in this, what we've said so far, I think.
Yeah. And then kind of the other part of the story is basically how democracy hasn't been the brake on capitalism since the 1970s.
You mean like the check or like the balance?
Yeah. So, democracy hasn't worked that well as a check on the excesses of capitalism. And that's a whole other thing. So, we under some of the assumptions of one system that people live in, and they live in this other system, which we, call democracy. And there's all these attempts to, make sure that political system doesn't provide a break or a check on our economic system. And
that's part of the definition, right, of free, voluntary free movement. If government intercedes, then it's not that anymore. But I guess what people aren't understanding is we already have that. The government has made many choices in breaking or curbing capitalism, especially when it runs against the value of human life.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for all your help.
Hey, you're welcome.
You've given me a lot of time, and I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.